do wherever I can is expedite the process. And so for those of you who may not have already done this or are not familiar, here's some quick directions showing where you are able to mute your microphone here, and also where you can set up a chat over here. If any of you would like to sort of provide a few comments along the way via chat, you can do so. You can open up your chat window and then just type in a few comments. Both in light of the time we have and also to kind of keep us kind of focused, I'll do my best to kind of monitor the chat, but I may not be responding to it immediately or even that much, just to keep us on track. I also wanted to let you know that at the end of each of the sections, which you will see here, each of these sections will have, once we get into the body of this, about a 5-minute opportunity at the end of each one, where if people do want to ask a specific question relative to that session, you can raise your hand, and you can raise your hand by, at the bottom of your participant window, you'll see a little button on the right-hand side that says raise hand. If you press that, a little hand will pop up and we'll see it. And then I will acknowledge that person who might have a question to raise their hand, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question, and we'll do our best to answer it. And each one of those will be pretty strictly tied to about 5 minutes. So that, again, is just to keep us on track time-wise. We're going to start with an introduction and a quick overview, followed by a review of the Planning Committee 4 meeting that we just had. After we've taken a look at that, we have some proposed ideas to try and help us consolidate some of the schemes, which I'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later. 15 minutes to talk a little bit about what we're calling some guiding principles that we think we have kind of extracted from the work that you have done so far, and then go through some prioritization exercises. We have a couple of questions that we're going to ask you. We'll take a quick break and we'll try and just tally up the input that you give us this evening. And then we will give you a quick review of that input and finally talk about next steps along the way. So this is our third and kind of final core facility planning meeting. And again, thank you very much for participating, particularly under the circumstances as they are these days. So here we are, third plan development meeting. After we do this work, we'll consolidate it, and then when we get to next steps, we'll talk about where we're going with all this excellent work that you've done along the way. Our objectives for tonight are firstly to try and, as best we can, what I'll put in kind of quotes, finalize the prioritization of district need over time and understand your rationale for that. So what we're really trying to get at is ideally one if we can, but it may end up being one or two more than that, sort of preferred approaches for sequencing future projects within the district. And you've already done a lot of the foundational work for this. The second thing is we want to take those, ultimately develop those scenarios so that we can collectively feel comfortable about taking the preferred approaches out to the broader community in the future for their input. So they'll have an opportunity to see the work that you have done, the information we have given you in order to do that work, and then they can provide their own input with regard to the outcome of that. So quick very, very high level review of need and goals. I'm not going to go into any depth on this because you've seen it so many times, and I'm sure you have it emblazoned in your memory at this point. But you will recall that we've been really talking about these three kind of key buckets of information, which are facts that are then driven by the goals and vision of your group, your broader community ultimately, and then of course the vision of the district as well. And you remember all of the different kinds of things in each of those buckets. This is really a graphic that shows the work that you have done so far. So way back at the beginning of the process, you remember, you went through a visioning session where you talked a little bit about some of what your goals and objectives might be for this effort and for the district. And that ended up actually getting revised a second time as you learned more about the facilities. And this represents here the top 12 goals that you had identified coming out of that second generation goal setting. So we all sort of started with the establishment of goals. The first planning meeting, as you probably recall, we asked you some questions about your broad approach, the thinking that you might have regarding a broad approach for what to do about the need and the facilities at each grade level. And you went through these exercises. And we also asked you to, in your own mind, just sort of think about how each of the facilities, as you know them, stands up to the goals that you had established. And we went through this exercise, which I thought was very, very useful in identifying those facilities that met the objectives, in your opinion, those that were in sort of a neutral zone, and then those that were clearly not aligning with the objectives. And then finally, the second meeting, which is our last, FPC4, was really looking at a prioritization of projects within all of that prior work that you had done. And we did 2 cycles of work, which I'm sure you remember doing. Which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Just as a quick reference to those top 12 goals that came out of the second go-around, providing built-in flexible adaptable spaces, opportunities for occupational learning, providing visible sustainability, and explain why sustainability has been built into projects, traffic impact around schools and improving that, providing next generation science labs, creating spaces that students are excited to be in, providing small collaborative spaces, safer pedestrian bike access, providing support spaces for teachers, improving gyms, athletic fields, and spaces. That was primarily focused at the high school level, although not exclusively, and rethinking outdoor spaces, particularly for rainy days, and creating environments that accommodate future technology needs. And the big picture, as you remember, is we're really targeting this central approach, developing a strategic phased approach, which is why we're asking you all to be thinking about prioritization of projects, because ultimately those will be broken into phases. And one of the great things you're going to be able to give input on is what you think should be going first, what you think should be going second. All right. Taking a quick look at FPC4 findings and analysis of the work you did during our last meeting. You remember this chart, I'm sure, which is essentially a breakdown of each of the projects, both kind of larger projects, so to speak, and then interim projects as well, that was used as a basis for your prioritization exercises. You probably remember our instructions, which is to create a list of projects in certain stacking. So for larger projects, you could not stack, and for smaller, you were allowed to stack up to 4. And here is the result of the 2 different rounds that you developed as groups. The first was large projects only, and then the second round really made it more difficult by having to insert possible interim projects into the grouping of large projects. And so when we looked at those and created diagrams that are a little bit more easy to see, these diagrams represent round 1 and round 2 for each of your 5 groups. So you can see here, the first elementary school, Island Park, was proposed by this group with high school work and Crest, and the middle school and elementary. So you can sort of see how they start to stack up. And then the second round work here. And what we noted was that there were changes between these two, not unsurprisingly. And this sort of comparison really starts to outline where some of those major shifts actually happened as you started to try and integrate interim projects. So things within these circled boxes, moving from one to the other, caused a shift in sequence actually. So here you would see, for example, Crest, which was in this location in the first round for this group, it became pushed to the 4th location because interim projects were added. These shifts were caused not only by the insertion of interim projects, but I think they were also caused by some groups kind of hearing the share out from other groups in a presentation, and maybe having some revised discussion about their sequence and maybe reshifting the sequence of their projects based on some of the things that they've heard, which is not a bad thing to be doing at all. And so within these 2 rounds, we're really kind of proposing that as a baseline, as a basis for kind of moving forward, it kind of makes sense to look at the sequencing of projects. So that's the real key piece, looking at the sequencing of projects using round 2 as the basis for this planning effort and the work that we do this evening. And the reasons for this is, one, it represents the committee's most recent thinking. It's the last thing you did working together. And the second thing it does is it begins to identify a priority of potential interim projects. These are the things like possible gym or cafeteria or those sorts of elements at elementary schools, and locates them within that proposed sequence. So this is kind of the latest, greatest work that you have done, and that will serve as the basis for what we're talking about this evening. What we wanted to do was actually do a bit of analysis then of this round 2 thinking and look for some patterns, if there were any, amongst each of the 5 groups. And the next slide you're going to see, the next sequence of slides, is really an attempt to analyze the work that you've done. So starting with the interim projects, all of the interim projects across all of the groups were consistently located within the first 3 priority items. And there's a strong logic behind that and good reason. One is that inserting these interim projects early on into the sequence creates a better equity across district facilities. So in other words, if you're going to replace one elementary school and you put in interim projects here that related to these 2 elementary schools, you're early on starting to try and balance equity across the district as best you can. Interim projects are also consistently proposed for 1, 2, or even 3 of all 3 elementary schools, depending on the group. So that sort of varied. We saw that as just something that was cropping up. Interim projects are proposed either before or after Island Park Elementary School. So they weren't consistently one way or the other, but because Island Park is always located as the first project, some of them placed interim projects before it, and others placed interim projects after. And one of the reasons why these were put in the first grouping of projects that was discussed is that because it's difficult to determine really the right amount of time between the implementation of an interim project and then the full replacement of that project, the sooner you would put an implementation project in the sequence, the longer that time might be that it would exist before you replace the facility. So those are all some of the reasons you gave for placing these up front. For Island Park Elementary, it was consistently the first priority of the 3 elementary schools. So it was very clear that this school, based on what everyone seemed to think, would be the first school out of the chute at the elementary level. And the reasons or rationale that were given that we extracted out of the meeting notes we took is that Island Park is central and visible, and it clearly has a lot of need associated with it. That replacing the old building would address a lot of the safety issues. And part of that is that the current building doesn't really have a optimal use of the existing site. And linked with that use, replacing it would provide an opportunity to improve traffic issues at that school, which everybody recognized very clearly. And then the comment that elementary parents there are very invested and involved and really feel like they would want to be represented by this project. And I think that could really apply to the other elementaries as well, of course. Putting Island Park in the first replacement elementary position makes sense. When we go back to the facility condition score, you can see that of the 3 elementaries, Island Park was in the worst condition. So that is in alignment with the thinking that each of the groups made, putting it in the first position. Another observation is that West Mercer Elementary was always the second priority of the 3 elementary schools. And some of the thought behind that we captured out of our notes is comments stating that it could address potential additional population growth from the downtown area. And this would then also, as part of that, reduce the reliance on portables to provide capacity if that starts to grow in that area. And then at the elementary level, the last bit of analysis, Lake Ridge is always the last priority of the 3 elementary schools. That was consistent across all 5 groups. And there was some general discussion about maybe that makes sense because in most people's estimation, it is in fairly good condition and isn't challenged by some of the other things that the first 2 schools might be challenged with, traffic and so forth. So one of the things we wanted to do then was look at your approach that has been discussed with regard to the potential placement of existing elementary schools, and also the idea that those would be replaced at the 450 to 500 student capacity with flexibility for future expansion, and how that would really line up with some of the goals that you had identified. And so on the right-hand side of this slide, you can sort of see checking off how this approach of replacement elementaries provides an opportunity to address many, if not almost all of the goals that were prioritized and ranked by the committee. Some of these others which aren't checked, arguably you could say, yes, it would check teacher support and yes, it would check improved athletics, but we decided not to check those because some of these, at least in earlier conversations, have been more specific to certain grade levels. So in this case, maybe a little bit more specific to the high school level, although we would just say that these goals at the elementary level would certainly be checked as well with the new facility. Looking at the middle school analysis of the work, all of your groups put Islander Middle School Phase 2, which are buildings 100, 200, and 300 within the first 3 priorities. And there were a number of very clear comments and rationale for doing that. I'll just touch on a couple of them. You can read through them. But the fact that it affects all the schools in the district and serves everyone, thereby really having the greatest impact on students. It has the greatest facility need in terms of the scoring, the facility condition scoring expected by the community. could be a showcase, allows for consolidation of buildings, and create a cohesive facility, and that could also potentially be a safety improvement as well. So very consistent input from the committee with regard to approach to the middle school. And replacing the older wings of the middle school indeed makes sense, and doing that work early also makes sense. As we refer to the facility condition scoring, you'll remember that the middle school buildings, the existing older middle school buildings, are the lowest scoring across the district. So that all aligns with each of your groups thinking, placing it in the first 3 priorities. When we look at the middle school and replacement of the older buildings stacked against the goals that you have established here, it checks off almost all of them. And again, in terms of things like outdoor space, you could arguably say yes, replacing those facilities would provide that opportunity as well. But we wanted to really just check the ones that were very specifically associated with middle school. So accomplishing a lot with a replacement approach. Looking at the high school really quickly, high school projects were interesting in that they were clustered either within the first 2 or the last 3 priorities. So there wasn't a super direct pattern, but that is the pattern that we detected. Some of the rationale behind putting projects earlier is that it would affect a large number of students across the district. There probably would be good community buy-in, and it would address some of the top planning goals, like the occupational learning goal, and that would include college and career readiness programs. Some of the rationale for putting projects later, so in this group here, is that some of the projects, some folks considered the projects to not necessarily be as core to student learning, and that there were a few comments also about possible candidates for booster or other outside funding, and so perhaps because of when that funding might become available, or the lack of clarity around when it might become available, maybe that would push some of these projects farther along in the prioritization. Looking at Crest Learning Center, the Crest prioritization varied widely, but it always included a pairing with administration and possibly other related high school programs. So initially when we started, Crest was kind of talked about as a freestanding component, but in the end, all of the groups, after discussing it a bit, ended up combining the replacement of Crest with the administrative portion of the district. And 4 out of 5 groups prioritized Crest administration replacement in either the first round or the second round of high school level projects. So if you look at, say, where certain projects here in red are a first round of high school project, Crest is sitting generally right in the middle between that first round of projects and the whole grouping of projects that came kind of at the end of the prioritization. Some comments around that included maximizing the use of the Mega Block site and accommodating enrollment projections for Crest. Replacing it would move it closer to the high school. You could also add some professional development space and may free up some other space for parking and learning space on the Mega Block site. And there is an opportunity when it does get replaced to create a stronger association with other high school programs such as CCR. When we look at Crest and compare it to the goals, So that full replacement checks off quite a few of the goals that you had identified. And again, just to sort of restate, some of these other goals like teacher support and outdoor space could also be addressed by a new facility, but we focused on just checking the ones that were, you know, obviously and immediately associated with a replacement project. So you would be getting a lot of work done again by the replacement of Crest. So at this point in time, we've just kind of walked through a very quick analysis of looking at patterns really within the 5 groups' second round work from your last meeting. And we can take 5 minutes or so if anyone had any questions around this that we can walk through in 5 minutes or so. You can raise your hand and we'll be looking for it. And if nobody does have any questions, we can move on to the next phase of the presentation. Here we go. Tiffin, yes, great. If you want to take your off mute, you have a question?
Hey, I do. Going through your presentation, I guess I realized that Lake Ridge actually did score worse than West Mercer on building condition. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, in case it would help people kind of think about the way it was prioritized. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is, it looked to me generally like West Mercer and Lake Ridge were grouped together in what I would call maybe like a funding package in terms of the timeline. So if that was the case, it may not be as material, but I guess I wanted to make sure we were kind of looking at all the information correctly.
Right. Yeah. No, you are looking at the information correctly. And I would say that, yes, it's true. Lake Ridge is slightly lower than West Mercer. And I think if you were to solely base your selection of prioritization on this score only, Lake Ridge would probably be in the second position. But as I recall, you know, really across the board and kind of listening to the overall committee back and forth, there were, and I'm kind of characterizing it here based on what I had heard, but there was a very consistent discussion about the condition and programs at that school. And I think that perhaps because of the success of some of the programs there, it was generally felt that that might be the least with regard to prioritization and the sequence. That's probably the best way I could put that. The grouping of the two together, which you're going to see later on in the presentation too, both Lake Ridge and West Mercer paired together, I would say that there could be a very high likelihood that those two projects could be put in the same phase, in which case it wouldn't matter. If those two schools had ended up being split apart by 1 or 2 projects, kind of sitting between them, then I think it would make sense to really dig into this discussion a little bit more. But I think what I would propose right now is, because they're paired side by side, it's a little bit less of an issue, perhaps. Did that answer your question? I don't know if I did or not.
It does. I guess I just want to bring it to the group's attention and
Yeah.
you know, confirm, you know, it was one, I remember we had lots of charts on condition and this was one of them. And I don't remember the nuances of the condition, but I just, you know, just made me reflect a little bit more. So it caught my attention and wanted to bring it up.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions at all before we move on? Oh, I saw a hand raise. Maybe I didn't. Let me see. I'm going to scroll down here to see. No hands raised. Okay. All right. So why don't we move on to the next phase of the presentation here. Okay. So the next piece of this is really taking a look at the work that you've done. We've kind of gone through a quick analysis, just looking at where things fell out for each of the 5 groups. There are definitely, which I hope you sort of saw that, some strong patterns that were coming out across the 5 groups. And remembering that our objective tonight is, if we can, to try and further consolidate approaches so that as we move out to broader community outreach, we're able to take out to that broader community, ideally a preferred approach, and perhaps maybe with 1 or 2 sort of backup approaches for discussion as well. In order to get there, we've got to come up with some strategies for consolidation of the work that you've done. And what we're hoping is that over the next few slides, some of the consolidation strategies we're proposing make sense and you find them acceptable. So what we're going to look at are really 3 kind of key approaches to consolidating the 5 schemes. The first approach is, after having thought about it, we think that it makes a lot of sense to focus on the major projects rather than the interim projects. And I'll talk a little bit about why we feel that in a moment. The second strategy is really getting ourselves in a headspace where we're thinking about, at the high school level, all projects at the high school level, we just start to combine them together as a grade level approach. So what that means is essentially is that CREST/admin as a project really becomes part of the high school projects as well. It gets embedded in those projects, and I'll explain that a little bit more, and you'll see what the implication of that might be. And then the third strategy is, if appropriate, consider adjusting the location of any outliers that might be remaining after we go through the first 2 steps. And I'll talk about that in specifics in a moment as well. But the asterisk down at the bottom is really important, and I want to make sure and put some emphasis on this. As we go through this consolidation effort, which is really focused at getting some clear preferred approaches, and again, ideally 1 preferred approach with 2 sub-approaches out for broader community input, I want to stress that the pre-consolidation plan studies, which are the work that your committee has already done, and all the related discussions that have been associated with it, are going to still be included in the long-range planning document for future consideration. So just because we're looking at consolidating the plan approaches now, it does not mean that this work that you're seeing on the screen goes away. It will be captured in the document and will be very, very important for people as they start to pick this up in the future and use it as a reference and look at what was said and talked about, that they understand that there were these approaches. Okay, so the first strategy, which is focusing on major projects. Why would we focus on major projects and propose that? One of the key reasons we think that's important, and this is coming directly out of a lot of comments that your different working groups sort of shared out with the broader committee in the last meeting, is that the amount of time between implementation of the interim projects and full replacement of the schools on those sites where interim projects are implemented is not certain. And that factor will play very heavily into whether or not implementation or interim projects really make sense or not. And so up here, we're kind of showing you an example of that, where if you implemented an interim project at an elementary level, let's say a gym, for example, at either one or both of these sites. Since we don't know whether or not the time between that implementation and the full replacement was 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, it makes it hard to actually determine at this point in time whether or not interim projects will make sense or not. And furthermore, there's really no guarantee that if you built an interim project on these sites, that the location of that project would be the best long-term solution for that site. In other words, it's not guaranteed that you would be able to keep that interim project and integrate it into the replacement design. We just don't know that at this point in time. And so because of that, what we're going to suggest is your committees, you've told us where those interim projects, if they were to be implemented, would occur. It's very clear. It's in the first 3 phases, and really it's going to be in the first 2 or 3 kind of project prioritizations. So we know that now. And when it comes time to determine whether or not interim projects actually make sense, the district and community will be able to refer back to what you said. But for now, we are proposing that you focus on the major projects. So let me see here. Yeah, so the result of this really is that for approaches that fill an entire priority position, so like the last 2 groups down here, fill an entire priority position with interim projects, focusing on major projects simply shifts these projects forward. So we're going to say, okay, we know if interim projects were to happen for this group, they'd be early on in this, somewhere in this zone, but let's focus on the main ones, we'll shift. For approaches that combined high school projects with various other interim projects. So these 3 groups are an example of that. Focusing on the major projects will allow additional high school projects within that first high school priority position. So in other words, some of the projects here, depending on what the priority projects are at the time, could be migrated up to an earlier position of work. So those are the things that it will do. So essentially, as we shift from this to this, that's how that consolidation strategy impacts. It moves CREST and admin forward. I'm going to go back and forward one more time again so you can see it. It moves each of these forward, and it backfills high school projects into these positions. So that's really the result of our first strategy. The second strategy is to look at combining high school level projects. And so this is really combining CREST and admin with the other high school projects. So why would we propose doing that from the standpoint of prioritization? Well, firstly, when we go look at CREST and admin, and if we take a quick kind of back of the envelope assessment at how large that project actually is, meaning square footage and probably ultimate, cost for that project, let's say. That project, CREST admin, is significantly smaller than your other replacement projects. It's going to be significantly smaller than replacement of an elementary. It's going to be significantly smaller than replacement of the remaining middle school buildings, for example. So therefore, combining that smaller project, the CREST admin, not as a whole block, but as a smaller project with other high school projects, really reflects that distinction. That it reflects the idea that CREST and admin, both from size and probably likely cost, might be more on the order of size and cost of some of the other high school projects that have been proposed for the different programs. It does not really represent an equivalent for a replacement of an elementary school. So final prioritization of individual high school projects will be determined in the future. However, what we did notice is that the replacement of CREST admin, based on the work that you did, which I'll show you in a moment, really should be considered as a candidate for the first round of high school projects. So I know that's a little hard to follow, but I think the graphic will help illustrate that. When we went back and we looked at all of the 5 groups and the locations of the specific high school projects that were located in the priority sequence for those groups, and we scored them, this is what we saw. We found that across the board, if you looked at the scores, tallied them, that CCR ended up being the #1 priority as reflected by all 5 groups together. That shared support was the second priority, and that CREST administration replacement ended up being the third priority, science is fourth, and so on. And so that suggests then that when CREST administration becomes really thought about as a high school level project and is grouped together with the other high school program projects because of its size, that it would be within the first 3 projects, identified in the first 3 projects. So essentially what we're talking about is that as we combine CREST administration replacement project with other high school level projects, we make this shift. So CREST and admin would then shift over to this high school grouping of projects. It becomes one of the top 3 because we can stack up to 4 high school projects in here. That CREST admin in this position would shift up to the top 3 and be joined, and so forth down the line. So again, this reflects the size of CREST admin relative to other replacement projects. And one of the big things it would do for us this evening is within that logic, it allows us to further simplify the prioritization. So here's the result of that shift. I'll go back and forth so you can see it. So here you see that shift: high school CREST, high school CREST, CREST falling within the first grouping of high school projects. So now we move to our third proposed consolidation approach, which is adjusting the location of outliers. Why would we do this? The planning committee has discussed, and you can see obviously the one outlier we're talking about. And I do know, I will say right now, the strength with which this group feels the pool should be in the second position. And it's recognized, and I want to be very clear that that statement and the placing the pool in that position will be documented in the long-range facility plan for further discussion. Okay, I want to be very clear on that. But as you can see, it was one group that had placed it in that location. And so there was discussion amongst the planning committee, at least by some of the members of the committee, that there may be a desire for a partnership between the school district and the city for modernization or replacement of the pool. And which is a great idea if you can pull it together. I think that's a wonderful idea. But pending the timeline for that partnership, when it could happen, when it could be worked out, and just going through the conversations, that conversation may be supported by a little bit longer timeline than putting the pool right up front. So that's one thing to think about. But another very important thing to think about is that the district has recently and is currently investing about $3 million into this pool facility. And you saw a little bit of a discussion about that during the course of our last meeting. There's been repiping of the building, and there are various other upgrades that have been happening to keep it functional. And that also includes a new roof and some of the other mechanical systems. And so similarly to the thinking around an interim project and not wanting to throw that capital investment away, the fact that there has been a recent $3 million investment, some of which is ongoing, might suggest that the pool replacement might be pushed a little bit farther down the line. And so what we are proposing is really to align everyone, or align the one group with the position of the other four, for purposes of taking this out to the community, the broader community. And I do think it will be interesting to see what other community members out there may have to say with regard to this particular component. But the adjustment of outliers essentially creates this shift we're proposing and ends up with this result, basically aligning the pool project with the other proposals. What it also does then, actually does a whole bunch of things. It shifts all of the projects forward basically in that group, which puts Island Park, the first elementary, consistently within the first 3 project positions. And so it basically, from the standpoint of Island Park, creates alignment with the other plans, specifically with regard to the concept of doing something at every grade level as soon as possible. So you'll see now in each of the group's work, you see work at the elementary, the high school, and the middle school level in different sequences within the first 3 prioritization positions. And the other thing that this does, kind of going back to the comment about Lake Ridge, is that positions 4 through 7 on each of the groups becomes identical sequentially, which really focuses our discussion around what the priority is for the sequence of positions 1 through 3. That becomes the real key sort of piece to resolve here. And in many ways, that makes a lot of sense, because when you think of all of this work from the standpoint of a strategic phasing of projects, it's really the first grouping of 2 or 3 projects that matter for that first phase, and really getting some clarity around what your priorities are for the sequence of those first 3 makes a lot of sense and is very important. So with that, I'm going to leave some time now for any questions and comments you might have regarding these proposed consolidation strategies and how they work us towards getting a tighter group of plans that we can take out to the community for comment. If anyone would like to raise their hand, we'll recognize you, and if not, we can move to the next phase, which is guiding principles. Oh, here we go. Sandra, yes. You can unmute your mic. There you go.
Hi, I'm not saying it's wrong or right, just had a question, because it seemed like consistently the CREST project was in the back for most groups, or in the back 4 through 7.
Yeah.
Not all groups, but consistently, because most people were putting some sort of interim project were in the beginning. And I guess I heard what you were saying, but I'm still confused at why interim projects were taken off the table and Crest admin was moved up. And once again, not wrong or right, just trying to understand. I guess I'm still a little confused at why that was done. I heard what you were saying, kind of, but it still wasn't clear.
No, great. No, please, I want to make sure it's very clear. So thanks for asking that question. So the first piece of it is the interim projects. We suggest that the interim projects are sort of set aside in a way and to focus on the larger projects, because it's a little difficult to know because of if you think of all the projects together as a big apple of need, it's a little difficult to know how big of a bite you can take at that apple of need, and how many bites you'll have to take before you've addressed it all. And because of that, the timeline between an interim project, a potential interim project, and the replacement project isn't clear. If, for example, you knew that you would be able to do an interim project right up front, let's say on the first priority position, and you were able to do that interim project for a school site that would not get replaced for 30 years, let's say, then we would have a conversation about your level of comfort with regard to essentially a high likelihood or possibility of, dare I say, kind of throwing away that interim project in 30 years when you replace the facility. And you might say, okay, if we get a 30-year life out of that, I feel okay about that. I don't know that you would. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But conversely, if it turned out that that interim project only had a 10 or maybe a 15-year lifespan because you end up being able to take bigger bites at the apple faster, then you may not feel so good about the potential of losing that interim project. And so what we're sort of left with, because we don't know the timeline exactly, is we now know what and where, if interim projects were implemented, what and where would be implemented based on each of the individual groups' thinking. You know, group one may have said, I want you to do both interim projects for the remaining 2 elementary schools. That becomes then a discussion point for future implementation once the timeline starts to become clear. And that's why I think it makes sense, now that we know where those interim projects could be falling, to just sort of let those sit and refocus on the bigger projects. Now, Crest admin, we initially proposed that, you probably recall, as a large block. It's a block that had to sit on its own in take an entire prioritization position. And in fact, at one point, it was Crest that was going to do that. And we had a proposal or an option for an interim Crest project, which very quickly got pushed off the table by everyone in the group. And then everyone very quickly combined Crest with admin. When we look at the actual size of that block, if you graphically, literally changed it to align with how big it is relative to, say, the replacement of West Mercer here, that size of that block is probably a third, I would say not even half the size of the block in terms of the actual amount of work. And what that suggested to us is it's a much more accurate representation to size Crest, even diagrammatically, in a way that it could be combined with other high school projects. And the other benefit of that too, which I think is just a good way to think about it from a planning level, is it really addresses and thinks about Crest as a high school level program. And so you're really thinking about high school programs at a more holistic, from a holistic perspective. And some of the discussions that were had by the group of potentially, say, combining CREST in closer proximity to CCR programs or enrichment, that starts to allow you to think about it in those ways. In other words, in this block, you might say, we are going to prioritize CCR, CREST admin, and maybe one other component, which aligns pretty much exactly with the prioritization that the group identified these high school projects at. And that's why we're saying, when you go to, bear with me here, when you go to this, when we looked at where everyone positioned the programs, with CREST coming in third, it made sense to us to say, if CREST is a smaller component and you are going to combine it with other programs, for future discussion, these would be two likely areas of prioritization that you would want to talk about immediately. And when the time comes, yes, it may be true that one of these others has moved into this, but for now, based on what the groups have said, we should look about moving this, shifting it up into the top 3. And this one from here, which is in front of other high school programs, shift it to the top 3. It wouldn't move back. This one, actually, this was already in this position, and there's gaps available, so we would move other high school programs up. And this one, the same thing. This one would create high gaps available. So it's really only this group right here where we're kind of, what I would say, hopscotching over other high school programs here. We would be saying that prioritization here suggests that it might be okay to combine it up here right out of the chute with, say, CCR and shared learning space. I know that was a long-winded explanation.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that. And the CREST part makes sense now that you're saying we're making it a smaller block, et cetera. I guess my other, just to simplify the first part of your comment, because I think all of us kind of knew that there were these time differences for how long it may take for certain things to be done, is really that as we do our proposal of, X dollars that we need, if we only got Y dollars, right?
Right.
Then we may look in those Y dollars of doing the big project and then the interim projects because we have X amount of dollars.
That's exactly right.
Got it.
So yeah, that is exactly right.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
Mm-hmm. Any other hands before we go to our proposed? Here we go, Sandra. Oh, no. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. All right, I'm gonna move forward. If I can here, there we go. Okay, all right, so guiding principles. This is the last grouping before we actually have you give us your input. So this should go relatively quickly. Some of you are probably thinking, guiding principles, what? This is the first time we've heard anything about that. So why would we propose a set of guiding principles in the first place? So we think that this is actually a good idea and a pretty important move to make. And so we'll start out by explaining why we think it's important, and then we'll propose the principles which come really directly from the work that you've done. So it's important because the plan proposals that have been developed by your committee really illustrate, we think, a set of basic ideas or tenets that can be used to inform and guide future planning discussions. So we're creating this document that another group of folks is going, well, we're going to go out to the community first with it to get their input, but then we'll create a document which at some point in perhaps the not too distant future, another group of folks that are going to pick up and look at, and we want to leave them with some really clear ideas or tenets that they can discuss and validate and use when they take this long-range plan as the basis for implementation. We think that summarizing these tenets into guiding principles will really help a lot with our outreach meetings and even future meetings beyond that to really facilitate future work with the plan. And we think that these guiding principles really fall into two categories. There are a set of guiding principles that really relate to your committee's overall approach to projects. So this goes right back to kind of the first planning meeting we had. And I think hopefully these principles will resonate with you because you kind of said them. And that the second group of principles relate to the prioritization of projects, which is really what we've been talking about over the last couple meetings. So the guiding principles that we've kind of extracted out of your work related to approach are these. At the elementary school level, replace or fully modernize the schools depending on the specific cost comparison or the cost implications associated with one or the other. So that decision to go one way or the other will ultimately be determined and based on a discussion of comparative cost at the time. But really the concept is to either really fully modernize them or replace them. Don't just continue to piecemeal tape them together over time. At the middle school level, the approach that's been quite clear is to replace the remaining buildings and finish that work rather than to fully modernize the remaining buildings. At the high school level, work at the high school should be to implement renovation or limited modernization with an emphasis on educational adequacy and program need. So these are all of the individual programs that have been identified at the high school level. And the committee really as a whole, I think, felt, based on your input, that the focus really needs to be addressing programmatic need over time at the high school. It's not to replace the high school in the foreseeable future. It's to address programmatic need. At Crest level, relocate and expand in a new location that is closer to the high school and consider co-location with administration or other high school programs. So that was really a pretty clear and consistent point of view coming out of our last meeting. And then finally, implement needed repairs as necessary at all facilities to maintain operations. And this was really just the realization that there will be maintenance and other items that need to be addressed over time, and to keep that on the dashboard and to address it on an as-needed basis. So here are the list then of guiding principles related to prioritization. And there are a series of, I think, 5 or 6 of them. The first guiding principle is, and you'll see them here in the diagrams that have come out of the consolidation for each of the groups, do something at every grade level as soon as you can. So here you see consistently something being done at the elementary level, Island Park consistently, work being done in the top 3 at the high school level, and in the top 3 would be included the Crest admin component, and then something being done at the middle school level. Island Park should be one of the first 3 projects, so that would be a guiding principle. That is consistent. that the prioritization for remaining elementary schools is West Mercer, then Lake Ridge. And there can be, of course, follow-up discussions about the specific sequence, but that's what we're seeing as of the work so far. Potential first projects at the high school include CCR, shared support, and CREST administration. And depending on when those projects are implemented, there will of course need to be a reconfirmation of those specific programs and whether or not they are still identified as being critical. And prioritize improvement of spaces with the core function to support education. And just to kind of give a shout out for the pool, it's very clear that the pool does have some role, education role, in terms of both teamwork and also simply learning how to swim. And so there is an educational component, which is why we put in here improvement of spaces with the core function of supporting education. So that really kind of lumps this group up here, which is in alignment with what each of the groups have said to date. So here are those guiding principles for prioritization that are pretty much directly represented by and coming out of the 5 proposals that we have seen to date, with a little bit of consolidation adjustment. So with regard to guiding principles, are there any questions or thoughts associated with that bit of information? Jim, you want to unmute your microphone there? You'll have to unmute.
There we go.
All right.
I have a question about transportation, which was listed as twice among the priorities, and one of them reasonably high. And the approach that you all have taken in this work has been to address facility by facility,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's discrete unit by discrete unit.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to improve transportation at the schools on the island, I think we need a more systematic approach.
Mm-hmm.
We have a high school that's at one end of the island, and we have a middle school that's at the other.
Yeah.
And if we're going to make improve bicycle and pedestrian access and reduce or improve the traffic experience around those schools, we need to look at how those, not just in their local vicinity, but how they connect with the rest of the island.
Yep. Yep.
The city has done two, over the past 30 years, has done 2 very elaborate bike and pedestrian plans. Both of them show connecting the schools with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the high school connecting to the south end, and the middle school connecting to the north end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that's within the scope of what you were charged with, but I am curious at what point or where that might be addressed.
Right. Yeah. No, this is a great question and a good point. And it's actually a point that comes up pretty regularly in school districts. The question of student safety and, both pedestrian, bicycle, between facilities or between the facility and their home. And the thing that we kind of end up bumping up against in pretty much every one of these cases is that as soon as the implementation of a strategy involves being off of district property, outside the boundary of the control of the district, it becomes difficult for us to plan with any specificity regarding what might be done. Now, having said that, what this whole conversation really brings up is the need for, and I think this may be where you're going with this, the need for, or a recognition of need to coordinate with and partner with other entities on the island, jurisdictional entities and so forth. And so realistically, I think the best that we would be able to do in the district's long-range plan is to, and we will do this because as you point out, it has been raised a number of times, is to point out the concern and need for improvement of pedestrian and bicycle access across the island from facility to facility and facility to homes. So we should include that in there. You know, the next step up, the next step to ratchet up would be to kind of recognize that as a level of a guiding principle. Although, because the implementation again is sort of outside of our reach, I'm not sure that it makes sense to take it to that level, but it definitely needs to be included in the document. I don't know if that answers your concern, but it's a good point.
Well, I think the city and the school district tend to be a bit stovepiped on this issue.
Yeah.
And I think any encouragement to have them engage in the conversation would be valuable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're taking notes here as we speak, and we will make sure that there is some discussion about the need for that and coordination with the jurisdiction to try and make improvements in that area where we can. Tiffany, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Jim's point. I think it's a really good one. And I think to push it a little bit, I would at least in the plan really emphasize that the school design needs to consider these connections and incorporate them. Because I mean, Jim understands this. It's fundamentally never going to happen if it's really not kind of pushed, because it's really always an afterthought.
Right.
And Jim knows more about, I think, what happened with Northwood. But I just remember after the whole school was designed, we started getting emails from the PTA to like request the city do this project, you know, through their TIP process and everything. And I'm like, okay, great. But like, it's just kind of a backwards way to think about it.
Right.
And Jim could probably comment more on what happened. I wasn't like really involved in that, but it was, and then I remember I was like emailing the PTA. I'm like, well, what specifically is this project for? And they would reference me back to the TIP, which had almost no information. It just wasn't, you know, from what I saw, it wasn't kind of clearly defined what the project was supposed to be. It was almost like, oh, we built a school. Now we got to make sure kids can get there safely.
Right, right. Yeah, and I do know there, as I recall, I'd have to go back through the notes, but there were some very specific areas of concern too, like the area right adjacent to the middle school seems to kind of ring true in my memory. So I think when we incorporate this into the document, it may make sense to not only make have a general discussion around the need for this in coordination with the jurisdiction, but as we go back through the notes, if we're able to identify and extract out very specific areas of need at, you know, at or around given school sites, we'll try and do that as well. So, and ultimately what needs to happen is it would be great if this, the document, you know, a copy of it was given to the jurisdiction, and then, you know, at some point in the not too distant future, if it could then just sort of serve as a very high level basis for discussion around the need for this pedestrian and bicycle improvement, just use it as a way to kick off that conversation as early as possible. But it is, again, it's outside the boundaries of district property, so it's.
I guess I'd say it's outside the boundaries of district property, but if the schools were designed to sort of incorporate these access points, I mean,
Yes.
right, you incorporate access points for buses, for
Totally. Absolutely.
Like if you literally incorporate the access point for, pedestrian and bicycle and make it a prominent part of the project, then that just, helps give it a little more oomph.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, I'm aware that it's like, it's the right of way is a different jurisdiction and everything, but
yeah. And you're making a good point, and you're kind of touching on this gray area where there's a crossover between the long range facility plan and the elements that it sort of outlines for future discussion. And then the actual process, which includes goal setting and visioning for each individual project as it's being implemented. And so, when you replace an elementary school right up front, when you're doing that, you should really be talking about the specific vehicular and pedestrian goals associated with the redesign of that project. So I guess what I'm saying is I would anticipate that when those projects get implemented, that those conversations would be had. But I do think that we can put a brief discussion in the long range plan about the need to consider separation of certain types of circulation. So we'll include that.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, great comment. Anybody else have a hand raised before we give you guys the hard work here? Short but hard work. Okay, David?
Sure. I like the work you've done on the high school to consolidate all the high school projects. I think that is super useful. I think one concern that was raised before is when we have two elementary schools beside each other, do they happen at the same time, and is that going to be a problem for housing the students in the intermediate while the construction is occurring?
Mm-hmm.
That was the second problem. I think the third issue, when Northwood was planned regarding transportation and traffic around it, I think we did talk to the city about some of the traffic changes that could have happened,
Mm-hmm.
that did end up happening. And the idea was, before the school was built, there was no traffic data that indicated those changes should have happened. And other changes from actual traffic data may have been suggested as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a desire to postpone it and wait till after the school was built, collect data, and make all the changes at one time.
Right.
Versus at the high school, I think there was a little bit more confidence what was going to happen there. And so some of those changes kind of happened much more concurrently. And I would think, as we think about Island Park being replaced, because of its proximity to Island Crest Way, I think there'd probably definitely have to be upfront traffic discussions and thinking about ingress and egress from the school kind of much more holistically if we intend to have our Island Crest goals be met.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you pretty much nailed that right on the head. Is that when you will likely be able to address a number of the traffic issues there, probably many of them, and there may be a few that are going to be very challenging to try and address. But either way, that whole conversation, to your point, would need to be immediate and right up front for sure. With regard to the two elementary schools sort of side by side, ganged up, West Mercer and Lake Ridge, Yeah, I think that the issue you're talking about really is a question of swing space to some extent. There really isn't swing space availability on the island. And so I guess I would have first of all, the point is a really good one, and that needs to be considered very carefully when these projects would actually come into being and are being implemented. The first thing I think would, at a individual project by project level, there would need to be a study to see whether or not at each site you could actually construct a new school while maintaining existing operations on a site. And so that would have to be done in the future when you're preparing to replace the school. But the other thing is that what's very common when you're doing two big projects like this, let's say they were done in the same phase of work, to do them over, not concurrently necessarily. So you might have one done in the first, say, 3-year period, and then the second one would immediately follow right after in the last, the next 18 months, basically. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have, even if they were in the same phase, 2 schools be put into that position at the same time, unless you wanted to do that. So, but those are all really good points.
Great, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Any other comments or hands before we ask you your opinion here? Yes, Jim. Oh, okay. Jim's hand's still up maybe, I guess, but that may be from before. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, we'll now go to our questions for you, which is what we'll kind of put in quotes here as a final prioritization, which is really the work that you'll do that we hope to be able to take out to our outreach sessions at some point here in the future. So as we're preparing to ask these questions, it occurred to us that we might need to actually go in the wrong direction first, which is rather than create fewer options, to actually insert one more option for you. And really the only reason for this is because the primary question involves these first 3 positions, and every possible combination except for one is represented by these 3 positions. So rather than having to have somebody ask, hey, what about the missing option, we thought we would provide it for you. So just as an overview, a reminder, positions 4 through 7, the last ones, are all sequentially identical across all of your plans. And we're going to focus this discussion on the first 3. And so the first 3 is directly associated with this guiding principle of doing something at every level as soon as you can. And the one missing group is this one, where you have, for example, Island Park, high school, middle school. This is the one option involving the front 3 that's not existing there. And we're not saying that this is the option that you should do by any means. We're just including it as to give you the full menu of possibility associated with these first 3 positions. Okay, so that's what we're proposing. So when we do that, the planning options really fall, the 6 planning options really fall into 3 basic groups. And those 3 basic groups are the Island Park first group. So Island Park followed by a high school project, followed by middle school, or Island Park followed by a middle school, then a high school. The middle school first group, so middle followed by high school, or middle followed by Island Park. And the high school or with CREST as the first group. So high school CREST followed by elementary, high school CREST followed by middle school. And what our question to you is, we have two questions really that we're going to have you answer for us. And what we'll do is have you answer these questions, and then we're going to take a brief break while we kind of tally really your answer to this first question. So you can go get a cup of coffee or whatever, and then come back. But first question is really, which sequence of projects do you most support? In other words, which do you think would be the most logical and best sequence given for these first three projects, given everything you have heard and come to know? Considering, for example, facility condition. Which facility is in the worst condition? And you may remember that based on just the scoring of condition, Island Middle School, just anecdotally, has the worst facility condition score and some of the most critical maintenance issues, including a need to replace the roof very, very soon. Considering what project might create the greatest benefit, in other words, which learning environment is really kind of the worst for students across the district, and by fixing it, you're going to really give the most benefit. And knowing that Island Park Middle School or Islander Middle School and Island Park Elementary might be considered the worst, in that 2/3 of Islander students, roughly 2/3, spend most of their day in the older buildings at that school. And with regard to Island Park, all of the Island Park students are either in the old building or in modular classrooms. Considering the broadest impact, which project would impact the most students if you felt that was important? So the largest number of students will be positively impacted by Islander Middle School replacement. Even though the high school has an overall larger enrollment, most of the proposed projects for that high school are really program specific. So in most instances, a percentage of the high school students would be taking advantage of a specific programmatic improvement, which kind of means that Islander may offer the broadest impact. Considering your committee goals, which, in your opinion, best aligns with the top goals that the committee has identified? And we're going to let you kind of think about that one, because there are a number of goals there. And also considering which sequence might garner community support. In other words, which will make sense to your other community members and which will resonate with them for some reason. And remembering that in the short term, as people have said in the committee, more students will experience benefit associated with Islander Middle School replacement as it serves the entire district. High school does, of course, too, but again, they're the programmatic targeted pieces there. So whether or not you think that's important or not, you can kind of think about that. Are there any questions or comments about any of those points that we've made or what we're asking you to do before we go into the question? And if not, I don't see any. Now we're going to ask for your input here. So basically, here is the official first question. Here are the things that we thought should be considered, and there probably are a few others. And we're going to ask you to take 5 minutes to just think about this. And what we will like you to do is provide your answer in the chat category. So you basically select this to host. You can send it to the host. So that way, for those, I see some of you are popping up as well already. But if you send this to the host, it will keep it a little anonymous to everyone else, and you won't influence other people in the group. And you can just type in your answer, IP2, IP1, MS1, and so forth. And so think about it, send the information to host in the chat, and take 5 minutes or so. I'll give you a minute warning when we're on our kind of last minute, just so you know. So go ahead and think about it. And again, focusing on just the top first 3 priorities, because the rest are in the same sequence already. William, you have a question?
Yeah, when we are combining the high school and the Crest renovations, are we assuming that that is the same size as an Island Park or IMS renovation?
Yeah, I think the general idea is that you would, the box associated with high school and Crest would allow probably 3 or 4 projects in that grouping. And so one of which would be the Crest admin project. And another one could be, if we stuck with your, the overall group's prioritization, CCR would be there. Creating shared learning spaces would be another. And then maybe there's a 4th one too.
Okay, so just we're building in as many projects as possible to
That's
make
correct.
it. Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's
Thank you.
correct. So we should end up with roughly a tally of about 26 votes here. You can vote early.
Leroy,
yes.
Leroy, I'm having a hard time trying to figure out how it gets sent. I got the message to Brandy Fox, but how do I send it?
You know,
just press enter.
Just press enter. Okay.
Oh, just enter. Okay. Well, doesn't seem to be doing it.
Brandy will let you know if it shows up. So these are just so you know, when you're sending it to the host, you're sending it to Brandy.
Yeah, I understand.
And we'll compare the vote count against what we expect, which should be 26. So we'll know if we don't have enough, and if somebody does have a problem, we'll do our best to We can do verbally too if we need to, frankly, as a fallback for those who can't get through. So I'm going to give you the 1 minute warning here. Has everyone had an opportunity to make their selection? Okay, are we good? Okay. All right, so I will move on to the second question here. So now for the second question, and this is the last one, we would like to know why you think the sequence you selected makes the most sense. So why do you feel that way? And so for this, what's really important is you're going to do the same thing, click on chat, you're going to send it to the host, and we need you to first restate your selected option, which I see some of you are doing already. So you're going to say, for example, MS1 because, and then give your reason of why you think that is. Just type that in a sentence or two or three if you feel like it needs to be that much. And we'll give you
I'm having the
same problem.
I'm having the same problem. Yeah. When I say, I have a note that says file, and I click on that, and it says Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive, Google Drive, box for your computer. So.
Okay.
Bob, can you, if you type where it says type message here, and then just press enter?
Yeah, it doesn't do anything.
Doesn't do anything.
No, when hang on a minute. Okay, now it looks like it did.
Oh, I got it.
All right.
Okay, there you go.
Awesome.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give the 1-minute warning here. Okay. So just a couple more seconds. Okay, so why don't we take maybe a 2 or 3 minute break. Don't hang up on us. You can either just hang out for 2 or 3 minutes, or you can go get a cup of coffee or whatever. And then when you get back, we will share with you just the tally of where we're at right now. I think we may have 1 or 2 people who are on the phone who were not able to send a vote by chat. But maybe if that is the case, you could just, while people are breaking, you could just verbally give your selection over the phone to Brandy by unmuting. So we'll get together in about 2 or 3 minutes here. All right, so let's come back together here. I see that we had one person, Julie left for a moment. Hopefully she was back. She was having some audio trouble. So yeah, I see her. She seems to be back now. Okay, so why don't we, Jennifer, you're in control here. So we did a quick tally. I think we may have one or perhaps two votes missing. I think it may only be one. So we can circle back for that one missing vote, but this should give us a good indication of where people are landing. So we have 2 votes have been identified for Island Park, number 1. So 2 votes putting Island Park in the first position, followed by high school, then middle school. 2 votes for Island Park 2. So that's the Island Park followed by the middle school. 1 middle school 1, which is middle school first, followed by the high school projects, is 4 votes. The middle school 2, which is the middle school followed by Island Park, then the high school with Crest, is 16 votes. And no votes for high school projects being in the number 1 position. So at this point in time, I think this is a really, I think, good result. It's exactly what we were hoping for in terms of being able to take some refined level of prioritization forward to the outreach for the broader community. And yeah, no, this is exactly what we were looking for, really. So generally speaking, you can all see it right here is, while not unanimous, putting the middle school as the first project followed by Island Park seems to be the general consensus. And keeping in mind, of course, too, that when these projects are discussed later with regard to the size of the bite at the apple, we aren't necessarily saying that the bite size might be just a project in the first priority. It might end up that the bite at the apple might include a group of 2, or perhaps possibly even parts or most of 3 at the same time. So this is a good result for us to move forward with. We are not planning on sharing with you, just because we want to be able to go through all the tallies more specifically of why, and just sort of look for consistencies or lack of consistency behind the rationale. And so what our plan is for this is when we will share this back to you, we'll tally it up and make a list of the various reasons why, linked with the votes for the prioritized approach. And we will have that posted on the website for all of you to be able to see and access, along with, of course, this presentation. So that'll be the plan forward with that. Next slide. So our next steps for the effort is we have completed or nearly completed our 3rd planning meeting. We will be going out to broader outreach, and then ideally, after we have been able to have some outreach sessions with folks across your community, to have a final meeting with all of you, for those of you who are interested, and hopefully coming back for a brief meeting, or perhaps we could even do that online as well. Just sort of sharing back feedback that comes back in from the broader community, and whether or not any of that feedback gives cause for some reconsideration here or there. And then after that, we'll be putting together a draft report. So next slide. From the standpoint of dates, and I will emphasize, as you can see in bold, these are all tentative for obvious reasons at this point. We'll be providing a board update with the information that we received this evening. That is tentatively on the 23rd. Based on our current schedule, staff, student, and community outreach would happen in May, but obviously if the current COVID situation prohibits that, we come up with a plan B. And then based on our current plan, the final facility planning committee meeting after we've done the community output would tentatively occur in June. And so we've also got ongoing discussions for alternative plans for this. In any case, we will not skip the community outreach portion of the work, because that's very, very important to be able to share all the work you've done out and move it forward for kind of some broader output. Yeah, so next slide. With that, we just thought we would offer up a few minutes at the end for any questions or comments you might have regarding the tally of the vote, or if you had any other specific comments. And I just also want to thank all of you again for the amazing level of commitment that you have all given to this effort to date. Without your effort and coming back every time, we could not do this work. And even if we did do it, it would not in any way represent the values and the prioritization of your community. So thank you very much for that. With that, I'll kind of open the floor if anyone wants to raise their hand at this point. Ask a question of anybody. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay. All right. So I am not seeing any hands. So thank you all so much. And we will get this information posted on the website. And we will be getting back with you regarding the schedule for next steps. And in any case, it might only involve one more kind of closing meeting with you just to share back any feedback we've received. Thank you so much. And stay well.